Up next, we'd like to welcome Sara Paretsky. Hailed by P.D. James as, quote, the most remarkable of modern crime writers, Sara Paretsky is the New York Times bestselling author of 22 novels, including the renowned V.I. Warshawski series. She is one of only 4 living writers to have received both the Grand Master Award from the Mystery Writers of America and the Cartier Diamond Dagger from the Crime Writers Association of Great Britain. She lives in Chicago. Sara, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Sugi.
Thanks so much for joining us. We feel lucky to be hosting, if only distantly, literary royalty. In 2013, I was trying to write a novel about a female lieutenant who was fighting in Iraq. And there are libraries full of male protagonists of war novels, as I'm sure you know, and vanishingly few female protagonists. And I was trying to think of someone else who'd written about a character like this, or in coming into a situation where they were trying to write about a character in such a male-dominated field. And I went back and read your first V.I. Warshawski novel, Indemnity Only, and it was just an incredible experience for me. It was really helpful, and it's a brilliant, and all the books since.
Well, thank you very much. I hope it was a help and that you got your own voice out there.
It totally was. It gave me a tremendous number of ideas.
So there's a great passage about this in your introduction to the 30th anniversary edition of Indemnity Only, and I wonder if we could start off with you reading from it for us.
Sure. I can still remember the October day when V.I. Warshawski first appeared in my life. I was in a meeting with my boss, whose office overlooked Grant Park. Fred, as I call him, had a gift for endless repetitions of the obvious. He also had a nasty streak and didn't take challenges to his ideas at all easily. As my lips murmured agreement, the balloon over my head said something unprintable. My attention wandered to the park 36 stories below. The dead trees, the gray day seemed as dreary as my own mood, and it was at that moment that V.I. came to me. I had been reading crime fiction since I'd been a teenager. The first novels I read were by Rex Stout, who grew up in the 1880s in the same part of eastern Kansas that I came from. In high school, when we were asked to write fiction for our English classes, I always wrote detective stories. I read a lot of Marjorie Allingham and Guy Marsh and Nicholas Blake, was briefly in love with Peter Wimsey, but it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I first encountered American noir. Like most readers, I fell under the spell of Chandler and the 2 MacDonalds at once. After moving through the 7 Philip Marlowe novels in short order, I read all the Travis McGee and Lou Archer I could find, discovered Cornell Woolrich, and was hooked on noir. At the same time, the more I read, the more uncomfortable the women characters made me feel. More specifically, I was uncomfortable with the way women's sexuality dictated their ability to act or to have good moral judgment. In 6 of Chandler's 7 novels, a sexually active woman, one who tries to seduce Marlowe, turns out to be the main villain. Marlowe is like an uncorrupted version of Adam and Eden. Eve, in the guise of the Big Sleep's Carmen Sternwood or the Little Sisters or Famie Quest, tries to get him to eat that apple. Unlike Adam, though, Marlowe is too tough for these wily women. The virginal women in noir fiction are virtuous by definition, but they can't look after themselves, and they have terrible judgment. Effie Perrine, Sam Spade's secretary in The Maltese Falcon, is the original good girl of noir. Sam never calls her Effie. She is always Angel. In contrast to Bridget's sultry sensuality, Effie's eyes were brown and playful in a shiny, boyish face. The fact that she is boyish in her looks means that she is not a sexual and therefore predatory female. Sam can trust her, but her childishness also makes her naive. At the end of The Maltese Falcon, the Angel cannot accept the fact that Sam sent Bridget over. Women work on intuition, as Sam tells her off and on throughout the novel, but a man has to deal in justice. Effie and Carmen Sternwood and all the rest of them made me want to create a woman private eye, one who would turn the tables on all these distorted versions of women's lives. The PI I imagined would have a sex life, and her sexuality would have nothing to do with whether she was a moral person. Sex would not stop her from being able to solve problems.
Thank you very much. I love that introduction. And one of the things that I really like about that book and VI in general as a character, and that helped me with my book too, is that idea that she could have a sex life. She has an affair with Ralph Devereaux in that first novel. That's not in, it doesn't, it's not part of how she's doing her job, right? It's not overdetermined. It's not made too much of a big deal of. It is a thing that happens. It's part of her life, right? But it doesn't become this mythic thing as it does in the like old noir stories.
Ralph refuses to think that VI knows what she's talking about, and he gets shot. I can't remember if it's the left shoulder or the right shoulder, but he comes back in a later book, and he gets shot in the other shoulder because he still doesn't listen to her. And I think you said, I think I read somewhere, it's probably the bullet's going to hit him right here and it'll be all over for poor Ralph. So I'm holding off on bringing him back.
I think I read somewhere that you were going to kill him and that your husband talked you out of it because he kind of liked Ralph, but you were so frustrated with him that you were going to off him at the end of the book.
Actually, it wasn't Ralph. It was Mr. Contreras, VI's extremely garrulous downstairs neighbor. I just got so tired of him going on and on and on that in the 6th book, I shot him. And Courtney, my husband, flung himself between the bullet and Mr. Contreras and deflected it into his knee.
I mean, this is one of the most interesting things about V.I. Warshawski for me, is to watch how the character has grown and changed and continued to evolve over this really long duration. You say that you wrote the stories in your new collection, Love and Other Crimes, over a period of 20 years. And it's one thing to create a character that breaks the mold and then to keep her with you, and to keep looking at her from different angles and putting her in different situations and keeping her fresh, to keep reinventing her over time is amazing. I'm really curious to hear you talk about how that has been for you over the years.
Sometimes it's a challenge. And there were a couple of times when I left VI and wrote a book that wasn't in the series, and in fact wasn't really, strictly speaking, a mystery at all. And that helped me come back to her and see her with a fresh eye, and also made me realize how important she is to me emotionally as a character. One of the short stories in Love and Other Crimes, Acid Test, has as its protagonist a young woman who's a forensic engineer, which I think would be a great occupation for an amateur sleuth, or not a professional detective anyway, law enforcement officer. And I thought, oh, if I had another series, then I could keep back and forth and keep VI fresh. And, I enjoyed writing about Temple in Acid Test, and I loved the dynamic between her and her hippie mother, who went to India when everybody in America was doing that and joining ashrams and becoming very spiritual. I always have thought, what about my generation? I never had children of my own, but what would my daughter or daughters of my friends, how would they react to their radical mothers or semi-radical mothers? And so Temple was sort of my version of that. But she didn't come to life for me emotionally the way that VI did. And so the challenge, as I see it, is, while I want VI at the center of my writing life, or as long as she continues to feel like the appropriate center of my writing life, how do I keep her fresh? And some of that is that the stories are very much in response to the events of the moment. And so the freshness comes from the context rather than from the interior life of the character. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, because I was thinking actually of Warshawski when, or I was thinking of, a couple of episodes ago, we had Curtis Sittenfeld, whose most recent novel is Rodham, about if Hillary Rodham had not married Bill Clinton on, and she had made a comment about how rare it is to read a book from the point of view of an intelligent and successful professional woman. And I actually was thinking about that as I was reading this book. The way that, and then there also in that book, the context keeps changing. And so we keep seeing how other characters actually react to this really strong woman. And
I haven't read it, so it sounds really interesting.
It is. I mean, I think it just reminded me of that, in that the intelligence is so unapologetic and often revealing of the characters around her in a way that, I mean, it makes sense what you're saying about how the setting would be the way to keep her fresh.
One of the things that I remember from that very first scene in Indemnity Only is where it's that great scene where the lights are out. And so she's having to interview this guy and she can't really see his face. And he says, "You have to go right away and do this job for me." And she's like, no, I'm going to do it later. And he's like, "Why not?" And she's like, "I have things to do." You know, I just felt like even then, like a professional female saying like, "I'm not doing this for you right now. I've got other stuff to do," is a way political. You know, I thought that was really a great moment that I always remember from that scene.
And also so much I spent well over 10 years, close to 20 years in the corporate world, but the last 10 years working for a very large company indeed. And, you know, it is really very much like the Army. I don't know if either of you has ever been part of a large corporation, but they talk about the chain of command and you must not back talk to your superior officer. And VI was very much always my version of thumbing my nose at all of that. No, I'm not doing it now. I'm doing it when I feel like it.
Yeah. And then she's like,
so a couple episodes ago, we were talking with the author Jabari Asim about the need to rethink police procedural narratives in the wake of Black Lives Matter. And VI has connections to the police. Her father was a police officer, so she comes from that history. But in her college years, she also participates in the freedom rides and supports Martin Luther King. I suppose this is also appearing in your giant artist notebook. I'm very curious. And of course, private investigators are different than the police. There's an important distinction there. Nevertheless, there's this current discussion over law enforcement and police brutality. I'm curious about if that's affected how you think about VI specifically, or just private eyes generally.
One of the things that I remember about Philip Marlowe is that his closest friend is with the police. The police are his antagonists and they're also his friends. And so this police officer, can't remember his name, comes over and plays chess with him, and they have that bond. There has to be a way for a private investigator to get access to ongoing investigations so that she knows where the police are with something. It's also, they're operating in the same kind of murky intersection of street and justice. And so I don't see ever creating a kind of story where there's complete hostility or no talking between police and private eye. At the same time, I had to start thinking about this very seriously about 2 decades ago, when I became aware of the torture ring that the Chicago police were operating with impunity on the south side of Chicago. And for those who don't know Chicago, the south side is essentially Black. Chicago is the most segregated city in America in a particular way, not just racially, but economically. And the only reason that I learned about this torture in advance of the world at large was that I had a friend who was the deputy chief medical examiner for Cook County, and he started seeing unmistakable signs on the bodies of victims of torture where electrodes had been attached to them, where they had been receiving third-degree burns. And so I became aware of this and started being part of groups that were speaking out against this. I followed the case carefully, closely, as an intrepid reporter named John Conroy kept trying to force the city to step in. Chicago, over the course of the decades, paid about $100 million in legal fees to defend the officers involved. They never fired them and they never held them accountable. I ended up writing a novel published in 2009 in the VI series called Hardball, which is based on that torture. And I don't believe that police station was shut down, but I don't believe that the behavior has necessarily disappeared. And in Hardball, VI's father was a patrolman. He wasn't ever a detective or a homicide investigator or anything like that. He was an easygoing guy who liked being on the streets. But VI is forced to see that this father, whom she loved dearly, he wasn't a perpetrator, but he was a bystander who didn't speak up and protest this. And I didn't want that to be the story of her father. I wanted him to be the knight in shining armor, but I couldn't do it and be true to the kinds of decisions that people made. You know, one officer who tried to speak out against this, he ended up dying of a heart attack, but he was so persecuted by his fellow officers. He was sent into gang warfare zones without backup. He would call for support in dangerous situations and his calls would never be responded. He had all the harassment that, and this was a white officer, he had all the harassment that anyone who's a woman or a person of color has experienced in trying to break a job barrier with rats in the locker and all those other even more horrible things. So the stress killed him, and VI's father makes the decision that he has a wife and a child and he isn't going to court that kind of ostracism. And it was a really hard book to write, and there were scenes in it that were really painful. I took part in writing a book called Anatomy of Innocence, which was a woman named Laura Caldwell. She died a couple of months ago of breast cancer. Terrible loss, terrible loss. But she was a lawyer who ran a Life After Innocence project at Loyola University in Chicago. So she didn't try to prove innocence of someone who had been wrongfully convicted, but she tried to help bring people, integrate them back into the world if they were released and if they'd been found innocent and were released. And she asked a bunch of us, Lee Child, S.J. Roseanne, and a bunch of other writers, each of us to write a particular episode, treating it from arrest to, and so on. And each chapter was about a different exoneree. And I was assigned the chapter about torture and met with a guy named Dave Bates. We spent a day together. He honored me with his confidence, but he was weeping with the shame of how he had responded to being tortured. And that's as close as I've come to it. And I found it unbearable. And I don't know how someone who actually survived it, who has to bear it every day, deals with it. So how to incorporate that, how to integrate that into writing private eye fiction is a challenge, because you don't want to write a polemic, you want to write a novel. You're writing to entertain people, and yet at the same time, crime fiction is where law, justice, and society come together in a way that you can write about these issues. So I think in some ways, as a writer of crime fiction, whether it's noir or police procedurals or amateur sleuths, you can take that challenge and create entertainment that educates. And in some ways, I think that Black Lives Matter, this movement, brings it all to the forefront of our minds and makes all of us aware that we have an opportunity as well as maybe an obligation to address these issues.
Thank you. That was an amazing answer. We just, talking about the complications of writing about it, and also talking about that specific case in Chicago, which I don't think, happened long enough ago. That's not really, I don't think a lot of our listeners will know about that case. We'll put links to all of the stuff you mentioned so that people can go back and look at it. It's very important. It's part of the background and history of this movement, in a way. And so, knowledge of that case in Chicago.
People really angry. It makes me angry, and it makes, someone like John Conroy, whose life was constantly being threatened because he kept writing about what was happening. That the state's attorney, which in Chicago we have state's attorney, not district attorney, but the state's attorney included our recent former Mayor Daley and various other prominent Democratic politicians in the city. They knew about this. It wasn't just his reporting, but they were presented with this, and it was just tossed aside with a kind of a boys will be boys attitude. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Sara.
Oh, thank you for your interest and for paying such careful attention to my work. It means a lot to me. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And we will remind our listeners to go out and pick up Love and Other Crimes.